In America, nature reserves are federally protected, and people can receive huge fines for crimes such as littering. One retirement community lived right next to a nature reserve, so they had to abide by these rules. But one man's neighbor refused, even though the man warned him about it. This is a Redditor's brilliant story about malicious compliance. Before we start, can we get this video to 1,000 likes? Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. With over 430 million users and 138,000 subreddits, Reddit has a community for everything. One of the most popular subreddits is r/malicious compliance. Malicious compliance is when someone intentionally follows a person's instructions, knowing that the person will suffer for it. The subreddit has a lot of posts about work, relationships, and parents. But nobody expected one of the top posts of all time to about a person's grandfather who talked to his neighbor about his backyard. In September 2019, user MLC2001, whose account is now deleted, posted to the malicious compliance subreddit. He said that his grandfather, or Gramps, recently moved into a retirement community. The community sat right on the edge of a nature reserve. In the United States, nature reserves are under federal protection, although laws vary by county. Since he lived right next to the reserve, Gramps did not have a backyard. Gramps noticed that one of his neighbors had a larger backyard than him. His next-door neighbor's backyard extended a good 8 feet past his. Gramps did not know whether that neighbor had permission to lengthen his backyard or not. One day, Gramps noticed that the neighbor seemed to be redefining his backyard. He was laying down expensive pavers that would extend his backyard even longer than it already was. The pavers stretched all the way to the fence posts that divided that retirement community from the nature preserve. The neighbor was already pushing the boundaries. Clearly, he was not supposed to be that close to the nature reserve. But he did not stop there. Now, Gramps knew that his neighbor was in trouble. The neighbor clearly thought that the park rangers would not notice the 2-foot difference, but Gramps understood otherwise. He needed to confront the neighbor. Gramps used to work for the National Park Services as a young lad. He knew that breaking the rules of a nature reserve could rake in some hefty fines. Gramps thought he had better warn his neighbor of the consequence of his actions. Unfortunately, he was still the new man on the block. Gramps approached his neighbor for a little chat. Before Gramps could say all that he had to, the neighbor became defensive. He told Gramps, "You're new here. I've been here 10 years." But that did not stop Gramps from trying to warn the neighbor. Finally, the neighbor got fed up and said, "Mind your own business." Gramps decided not to press the issue. The rude neighbor clearly was not going to change his mind, and Gramps knew what was coming to him. For the next year, nothing happened to the neighbor. Most tourists visited the reserve in the winter, and the area emptied during the summer. That is when the county arrived to check on the community. The county officials were going back and forth behind his neighbor's house, the workers pulling out maps and taking photos and making phone calls. Meanwhile, the neighbor in question was nowhere to be found. While this was going on, Gramps spoke to the other neighbors about the man who moved the fence. Gramps's new friends told him that this was not the first time that neighbor tried to move the fence. In reality, his backyard is supposed to be even smaller than Gramps' backyard. That meant that he would be in even more trouble. The county would have to move both of these cars to restore the reserve, meaning that they could be towed. And the neighbor had no idea he was away at another vacation home. Gramps just had to sit and watch. After several county employees visited the neighbor's house, they eventually taped a notice onto his door. Gramps walked over to read it. It stated that the neighbor was in violation of encroaching onto protected lands. He had 30 days to move both of his cars and remove the concrete. Also, he had to pay a fine of $11,000. The fine was so high because the paved roads interrupted the lives of endangered species that lived on the reserve. Gramps knew that the neighbor's life would only go downhill, as he was nowhere to be found. Gramps had his phone number, but he did not call him. After all, the neighbor explicitly told him to mind his own business. Both the cherry car and the golf cart were towed. Workers dug at the pavement and hauled away. This all occurred over several weeks. Meanwhile, the neighbor had no idea what the county was doing in his backyard. His fines continued to increase and his cars vanished. Throughout summer, the county employees transformed the neighbor's house while they piled notice on top of notice on his door. When November came, the winter residents returned. That included the neighbor. Gramps watched from his window. The neighbor tore through all of the notices until he got to the first one. Gramps stayed indoors the entire time. The last thing he wanted to do was confront the man who was frantically running around his house, desperately calling county representatives, and panicking over what Gramps had warned him about. 3 days after the neighbor's freakout, Gramps ran to him outside his home. The neighbor asked if he was around when the county stole his car and destroyed his backyard. Gramps confirmed that yes, he was there the whole time. The neighbor angrily responded, "Well, why didn't you call me when you saw them putting notices on my door? You had my number up north." Gramps's response is what made his story famous on the internet. Gramps admitted that he considered calling the neighbor about what was happening. However, the neighbor told him to mind his own business, so he followed that advice and kept the news to himself. This is what makes the story malicious compliance. Gramps followed the neighbor's instructions, and as a result, the neighbor suffered the consequences. He lost both of his cars and had a fine that was well over $11,000. Since user MLC 2001 created the post, it has garnered over 35,000 upvotes and 587 comments. Other Reddit users brought up some interesting points. One mentioned that the other neighbors did not call the guy either, so he probably isn't the most popular on the block. He was the most obvious about it. The Reddit user said about the rude neighbor. Over time, the residents have become more brazen, and suddenly they've taken more than they intended. Perhaps the metal fence and security cameras will make them more alert. Despite the story being on r/malicious compliance, the original poster said that Gramps never felt malicious about his neighbor. He assumed the neighbor would be notified and would straighten everything out before it got too far. He told Bored Panda, "I think Gramps just thinks it's funny now," he added. He simply butted out of everything and did not realize the gravity of the fallout until his neighbor returned home. It is the most passive revenge story on the internet. Reddit user MLC 2001 says that Gramps's story is a prime example of the rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Had the neighbor listened, he would not have lost tens of thousands of dollars. Gramps did what he would want others to do, but the neighbor did not. It never hurts to consider how your actions may impact others around you. The poster said, "Be like Gramps, not the neighbor."